Don't turn around. You don't want to see that.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Wilkin and Guttenplan's webinar, Who Says Money Can't Grow on Trees? My name is Mohammed, Salyani, and I will be your moderator for today. We have two excellent speakers with us. One is Mitch Frumkin from Kipcon. Mitch is the president of Kipcon, Inc., which is an engineering consulting firm that specializes in community associations of all types. He was instrumental in the development of the national standards for reserve studies. Kipcon is also the leader in providing green reserve studies. We also have Allan Samuels from Energy Squared. Allan is a partner at Energy Squared Consulting Engineers. He has been in the design engineering business since immigrating to this country from South Africa 33 years ago. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping rules. To ask questions, please use the questions pane in the GoToWebinar dashboard on your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar, but if your question does not get answered, we will get back to you with an answer. The webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our website, www.wgcpas.com, by Friday at the latest. We will also send all attendees a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation. We will be sending a survey after the webinar via email. We really want to hear back from you to see how we can improve your experience. Please return it to us. We really value your comments. Now we'll get the webinar started, and I will turn it over to Mitch.
Hi, everyone. This is, again, Mitch Frumkin. And what I'm going to be talking about today is green reserve studies and how the green reserve studies can help your association in saving money. While I'm sure most of you out there are familiar with what a reserve study is, one of the things that's evolved over the last few years, which I'll be talking about today, is a green reserve study. In regards to a regular reserve study, as you all know, it's a planning tool that establishes a stable and equitable funding plan to offset anticipated future major common area expenditures, which in layman terms means it makes sure you have enough money to replace your roof or your mechanical equipment when it comes time to replace it. But what's the difference between that and a green reserve study? Sorry, I touched the button. I wasn't able to move to the next slide. The green reserve study not only takes into account the replacement costs of the components in your community, but also takes into account the maintenance and the energy costs also. And it's based on the relationship between these three things, which is the basis for the green reserve study. And it also results in environmental benefits, because whenever you're saving energy, you're also helping to save the environment which produces that energy. Your association's reserve study is the perfect starting point for a green reserve study. The reason for that is it lists all the physical components of the community, which are the responsibility of the association to maintain and replace, which are typically known as the common elements. It also helps to identify all the components which require ongoing maintenance or consume energy. But how does this affect your budget? What kind of impact can it have? The pie chart you're looking at right now shows the typical budget breakdown for a typical community association. When you look at this, you'll see that repairs and reserves typically make up about 40% of an association's budget, while the operating expenses, which include the maintenance and the energy, make up 31% or about 30% of your budget. So when you look at the repairs, reserves, energy, and maintenance, they typically make up about 70% of your association's budget, which is a very large portion. Of course, this changes based on the type of association, with the largest percentage of this being when you're dealing with a high-rise building that has a lot of mechanical systems and uses a lot of energy. In order to understand the impact of these three things and the cost in your budget, it's important to understand the relationship between the three, the relationship between maintenance, energy, and replacements, which is really the basis for a green reserve study. And I think in a few minutes, as I show you these relationships, you'll understand why there are significant savings when you do a green reserve study. The first thing to keep in mind is when you typically set up a budget for your association, these three things have costs that you put into your budget. For example, this is the budget time of year for most associations, and when you put together your budget, typically you include in that budget the reserve amount, the maintenance amount, and the energy amount. But where do these costs come from? For the reserves, they typically come from a reserve study. For the maintenance, the cost that's put in typically comes from historical information that the association has gathered over the prior years in terms of how much money is spent on maintenance. And again, the same thing for energy. It's typically based on historical information on how much money is spent on energy, and you take these three costs and you input them into your next year's budget, which again typically make up to 70% of the association's budget. So when you look at this, you realize that 2 out of the 3 things you look at are based on history, and they're really not based on looking forward to see how you can have any types of savings by looking at the relationship between the 3. Again, the basis of our analysis is your reserve study. Up on the screen now, you see a typical reserve study and what it looks like. As you know, the reserve study is made up of 2 parts, the physical analysis and the financial analysis. What we're looking at right now is known as the physical analysis. And essentially all it is, moving from left to right, is a list of all the components, the quantity of those components, the cost to replace that component, what your beginning balance is. And when I say beginning balance, typically associations, other than new ones, have accumulated some money up until the point when the reserve study is updated, and there's a beginning balance associated with it. So that's the beginning balance. Then the next column is the estimated useful life for each component, and then the estimated remaining useful life. The calculation of how much the association should set aside is basically done by taking the total cost for replacement, subtracting from it how much money has been set aside already, and then dividing that by the estimated remaining useful life. So for example, if you have a roof that's $100,000 to replace, you've set aside $50,000 for it already, and there's 5 years remaining useful life, that means you would take $100,000 minus the $50,000 you've set aside already, divide that by 5 years left before replacement, and it would be $10,000 a year is the annual reserve funding amount. So that's the typical basis and the physical analysis for a community association's reserve study. The other part of the reserve study is the financial analysis, which is really just taking the physical analysis and doing a 30-year cash flow projection of how much money is set aside each year, when the replacements take place, and how much money is in your account. This slide shows this cash flow projection in numbers in a chart, and the next slide shows what this looks like in graphic form when you do a cash flow projection. This seminar is not about the different types of funding plans, but the graph you're looking at shows both full funding, which is the top line, and baseline funding, which is the bottom line. The bottom line and the concept behind baseline funding is that you just take your annual contributions and reduce them, so sometime in the future you'll go down to 0 amount in your reserve fund. And again, this isn't a presentation on how to prepare a reserve study, so I'm going to be basing it primarily on a full reserve study of full funding. And keep in mind that baseline funding, if anything, is something you should stay away from because it's very risky to do that type of funding plan. But this is what the cash flow analysis and the funding plans look like. Now let's start looking at the entire picture and what it makes up a green reserve study. What you see on your screen is the same reserve study you saw in the beginning of the presentation, but now what we've done is we added to the cost each year not only the cost of replacement of each of the components, but we've added the cost each year for maintenance as well as the cost for energy. So now we're looking at each 3 of these components that make up your budget together rather than separately. So when you look at this, you'll see the cost of maintenance and energy in red in the reserve study, which is the maintenance and energy for the existing components on the reserve schedule without making any changes to them. Now we take the real cost and we do the same type of cash flow projections we did before, except over a 30-year period, we're not only adding up the cost of replacements, but we're also adding together into that the cost of energy and cost of maintenance for each of the components on the schedule. And that's what this cash flow projection looks like. So what do? We take a look at each of the different components on the schedule that require any type of maintenance or any type of energy, and we analyze them to see if we were to replace them with something else rather than what's there now, how much money could we save by doing it. So for example, if we have a wood fence that requires a lot of maintenance and requires replacement in, let's say, 15 years, and we replace that with a vinyl fence, the vinyl fence could last indefinitely and would not require any maintenance at all. The same thing with a piece of mechanical equipment. If you have an air conditioning system and you replace it with something that is higher efficiency, then you could save money in the long run by making this kind of replacement. So what we're doing is we're replacing the original components with more high efficiency components, and now we're going to add up the costs again to see what type of difference it makes. Again, we have the cash flow projection that goes out 30 years, which now adds the cost of replacement, the cost of energy, and the cost of maintenance with a higher efficiency equipment and the lower maintenance components. So to summarize, in an example, if you take the original reserve study and just look at the replacements, in this case, over 30 years, the association would be paying about $5.7 million. If you add to that the energy and maintenance based on the original components without making any changes, it would be $6.3 million over a 30-year period. But now when we go to the green reserve study and we make replacements based on components that use less maintenance and less energy, the total comes to only $5.6 million over 30 years, which is actually even less than the original reserve study only for the replacements without even adding into it the cost of energy and the cost of maintenance. The thing that's very important to recognize here is that most associations are afraid to make these kind of changes because typically a vinyl fence will cost more than a wood fence, or a higher efficiency piece of mechanical equipment would cost more than a standard piece of equipment. But as you can see, if you amortize this over the full 30-year life, even if those pieces of equipment cost slightly more, due to the savings in energy and in maintenance costs, the overall cost goes down significantly over a 30-year period. And in this case, the overall savings over 30 years is over $700,000. The thing to keep in mind with this example is that I'm not even talking about a high-rise building. I'm talking about a standard community, maybe with a large clubhouse. And when you get involved in high-rise buildings and the significant amount of energy that they use, that $700,000 can turn into millions of dollars in savings over a 30-year period. So now let's analyze the information in a little more detail. The question becomes, should I wait until the replacement is scheduled and make the replacement with a higher efficient piece of equipment or a less maintenance piece of or component, or should I perform the replacement now? Let's give one example. We're going to take an HVAC system, an air conditioning system, and we're going to say that the replacement cost for that is $175,000. The useful life is 20 years. So the amount that you set aside on your reserve study just for replacement over that 20-year period is $175,000 divided by 20 years, or $8,750 a year. Our annual energy cost is $70,000, and as you can see, that's significantly more than the replacement cost. So if you add the two together, your cost for replacement plus your cost for energy is $78,750 a year. So what happens? We now make a replacement and we use a higher efficiency piece of equipment. In this case, it now costs $250,000, but the useful life is the same. So as I was mentioning before, the annualized reserve amount goes down or goes up to $250,000 a year divided by 20 years, or $12,500 a year. But the annual energy cost goes down significantly to $50,000 a year. So our annual cost for energy and replacement is $62,500 a year, a significant change by changing the equipment to higher efficiency. So what's the end result of this? The increase in the installation cost is $75,000, $250,000 less the $175 for the standard equipment, so it's $75,000. Assuming in this case, which Allan will talk about in a few minutes, that you get a rebate of 50% of the incremental cost of $37,500, then the additional cost for the association is $37,500. The next line shows that you're saving $20,000 a year in energy, So the years to break even is only 1.9 years to make up for the incremental increase in cost for the equipment by going to higher efficiency. So it's less than 2 years. Even if you were not to get any rebate on this, and the total incremental cost was the $75,000, that 1.9 years would turn to 3.8 years. So it's still only 4 years until you break even on the incremental cost. And then in the future after that, it's all savings for the association. So if you take this just over a 20-year period, the association could be saving 20 years times the savings each year, or a total of $362,000 over 20 years. So $362,000 savings by using a green reserve study and making the changes reflected in that study. So I'd like to thank you, and if there's any questions, we'd be happy to answer them at the end. And now I'll turn it back to Mohammed.
Thanks, Mitch. Now it's Allan's turn, and I'll turn it over to Allan. I know that you have some questions that you've sent in. We will answer those questions at the end once Allan is done. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. It is Allan Samuels from Energy Squared, and I want to talk about rebates that are available primarily in the state of New Jersey. Believe it or not, energy rebates in the state of New Jersey are probably the best in the country. There is a lot of money available, and I'm going to try to explain how to avail yourself of some of this money. Firstly, what makes a perfect project for going after these incentives? All projects are potentially capable of getting these incentives, but really the very best project and the no-brainers, so to speak, are those buildings that are 20 years or older, where the building envelope is in reasonable condition, where you've got the old and original infrastructure. There are many high-rise buildings and existing residential buildings, multifamily, where it's got the original heating systems and cooling systems. Those are perfect opportunities for letting the state pay for some of your remodel. Focus on low-cost upgrades. Go for the lowest hanging fruit. And where you have centralized heating and cooling, that is ideal. You also have to look beyond just those upfront first costs. That capital cost is not really the full picture. You've got to look at the whole life cycle cost. Often people just look at that first cost, but they don't realize the savings that are going to be had from long-term savings, from energy and maintenance, and certainly the money that's available for these upgrades. So there's three major components in terms of these savings. One is the energy savings. And you know, energy right now is fairly stable. The price of energy is fairly stable because of the large reserves that they've recently found in the United States. But certainly over the long term, I have no doubt, and I'm sure most people would agree, that the cost of energy is going up over the long term. So those energy savings are going to increase over time. Also, if you upgrade your equipment and have more efficient equipment, you're going to reduce the maintenance. I often see buildings where the maintenance costs and planned costs for maintaining existing equipment are just unbelievable. So definitely new equipment, efficient equipment is going to go down in maintenance. And then, of course, there's the incentives, which we'll get into a little more detail on. But these incentives really are ideally designed for high efficiency equipment, and usually they will compensate you for the cost of going from a standard piece of equipment to this high efficiency equipment, where you will be benefiting during the entire life of that equipment. So many upgrades have paybacks of under 3 years, and these days everybody's looking for investments that have under 3-year payback. Lighting in many instances is a no-brainer. Thermostats, the control of a lot of the HVAC, the heating and cooling and ventilation is so poor, and this equipment could run for days and days and days without being controlled properly. So putting in a fairly low-cost thermostat that, by the way, have become way more sophisticated now, but still are fairly inexpensive. that has a very fast payback. Boiler controls can return your investment in a really short period of time. Pipe insulation, air sealing and weather stripping, and finally low flow water fixtures. By the way, I'll just say as an aside that we all worry about energy today, but really if you look carefully at the news lately, water is going to become a huge issue in this country and frankly around the world. Switching to natural gas, I mentioned that the United States has found new energy sources. We have reserves of over 100 years of natural gas, and so changing your boilers from oil to natural gas is really a no-brainer. It's absolutely essential that you look at converting, especially if you have an older boiler that's been running on oil, maybe number 2 oil, where there are increasing environmental regulations as far as oil and oil leakage. Upgrading to a natural gas boiler can return 50% greater efficiency. So again, something really you need to look at quick. Going green, you know, most people think that going green means putting a solar panel on your roof or even a windmill. And really, solar panels and windmills do not begin to tell the story of going green. And I would like to make the case for solar being the last thing you want to look at, especially in the state of New Jersey. If you're in a high-rise building, it is using an intense amount of power for the small footprint. And think how few solar panels you can put onto the roof. Very few. And if you cover maybe a 20-story building, typically with as many solar panels as you can put onto the roof, it would cover less than maybe 10% or 5% of the total energy, electrical energy needed in that building. So it is a huge undertaking and really without great returns. According to the Department of Energy, saving energy in a building is typically going to cost you 3 cents for every kWh. Now, this is a survey done across the United States according to the Department of Energy. So saving energy is going to cost you 3 cents per kWh, and generating energy, maybe with a windmill or with solar panels, is going to cost you 10 to 15 cents per kWh. So I think without doubt, you first want to look at making that building as energy savings as possible and efficient as possible, and then go to maybe solar. Solar is not ideal for mid and high-rise buildings because of the intense amount of energy used in the small footprint of the building. And in New Jersey, probably a year or two ago, there were incentives, and there still are incentives called SRECs. That stands for Solar Renewable Energy Credits. And in essence, it's a payout for every megawatt of energy that you produce from solar. And 2 or 3 years ago, that payout was $600 for every megawatt. Today, it has climbed from under $100. It's now at about $200 per megawatt. So the incentives are still really, really small. And there's no direct incentive. If you go and buy a solar panel tomorrow, the government is not paying for, the local authority is not paying. There's still, I believe, a tax incentive, a federal tax incentive, but there is no New Jersey incentive at all payable for solar. So I would suggest you want to leave solar as your last option. New Jersey has set aside in 2014 alone $380 million. $380 million for these projects. So why shouldn't we get our hands on some of that $380 million? It's really easy, and there are people that are getting their projects funded by the state. where does this money come from? Well, if you look at your utility bill and you are with PSC&G or JCP&L or any of the major utility companies, you probably never noticed that there's a line item on your bill called societal benefits. And that societal benefits you pay every single month, and that goes into a fund for these projects. So actually the money is yours. You've been paying into it for a long time. Definitely you should make use of it. So anyone paying into these funds has the ability to use them for their project. So the major energy savings incentive is pay for performance, and pay for performance is one of these programs, the major one, and pay for performance alone has a budget of $71 million plus in 2014. And under the pay for performance incentive, they are looking for you to look at your entire building holistically. That means they do not want you to just change some lighting somewhere or change thermostat somewhere. They want you to, the idea is to look at the whole building and see what makes sense in that building. What should we do as a whole? Every single project, that means every building, has a potential incentive of $2 million. And I can tell you that that is not a theoretical value. That there is really a potential to get $2 million for your project. Frankly, even if you can get $500,000 for your project, it's worthwhile. Why not? Why not go for that? So in order to get onto this incentive program, you have to work with a partner with the state. So that is generally an engineering firm that has the experience to do this. And you have to model the building. What do I mean by model the building? I mean you have to make an energy model of the building to see what these savings will be. The state then scrutinizes this model, and this is the only thing that they will accept. And when they agree with you as to how much you're going to save, sometimes it's a little back and forth with the state over a period of time, but generally they are very fair, very lenient, and there is a lot of money out there. I can tell you we have got incentives of almost $1 million on numerous projects out there. So the other requirements for this program is you have to save a minimum of 15% and have a rate of return on this expenditure of 10%. In other words, any money that you're spending on your project has to be returned via energy savings within 10 years. I can tell you that 15% energy savings on a building is nothing. We could go into almost any building of 10 years and greater these days and save 15% with very, very, very little effort. So 15% of your energy bill is the minimum savings. And in order to do this, you can group high-cost measures like changing boilers or air conditioning systems with low-cost measures like lighting and controls. And all of that together is grouped together, and that 15% will come from the blend of all those items. Most projects that we are involved in, most projects achieve at least a 30% savings. Remember as well, I want to go back to the fact that as we're becoming more efficient, it has a tendency to also go and reduce maintenance costs. The state allows up to 2 years to fully implement all of these programs, and the incentives that they then pay out come in 3 stages. So the 3 stages, the first incentive is based upon the building size, and it is paid out when the incentives have been accepted by the state. That means the theoretical plan submitted to the state is accepted. The second incentive comes when everything has been installed. Immediately everything's been installed, the state pays the second incentive, And finally, the third incentive comes on an existing building after there are 12 months of utility bills following this upgrade program. So after they've seen the upgrade and we've seen actually what happens to the utility bill, they will then pay that last incentive based on what the savings have been. By the way, if we predicted that there were going to be a 20% savings in the building and it ends up doing 25%, the state will pay the increased money. If, however, it is below 15%, the state gives you another opportunity to go back and fine-tune things until we are over the 15% necessary. I can tell you that we have not missed an incentive yet, so I think it's a fairly easy project and program to follow. One other thing I'll mention, very often multifamily housing, there's funding issues. And if you qualify for pay for performance, if you're part of the program, there are very low-cost state funding for those projects. In addition to pay for performance, there's another program called Smart Start. And Smart Start is a lot simpler. Frankly, there are multiple contractors throughout the state of New Jersey. They're basically by region. And if you are upgrading one piece of equipment, a boiler, an HVAC unit, etc., the state will pay part of the cost. But the incentives are a lot smaller than pay for performance. And you have to use a specific contractor for that, whereas with pay for performance, you're free to use any contractor you like. One thing I'll just mention, in some buildings, and really is becoming quite popular now, there is a possibility for using combined heat and power and fuel cells. And what does that mean? So you can either use a generator in your building, or you can use a fuel cell, and we won't get into too much detail, but a generator produces both power and heat. And so you have the ability to use the generator to produce power in your building, and the heat is used for laundry, is used for domestic hot water. It could be used for any area that you need heat. It could be used for space heating in the middle of winter too. These projects are expensive, but there is $3 million available from the state for CHP, or combined heat and power systems. Remember as well that since Hurricane Sandy, backup generators have become very, very popular, and lots of people are interested and paying for major generators to be put in their facilities. This is a way of getting the state to pay for a lot of that expense. 30% of the incentive is paid upon purchase, 60% is paid upon installation, and then there's a final 10% paid of the verification of the whole system. The best upgrades, the ones we would recommend as really easy and the lowest hanging fruit, lighting. Lighting continues to improve dramatically. LED lights, where they used to be very expensive and sort of something that you look towards the future, well, LED lights are now. They are almost comparative on a cost basis with fluorescent lights, and the performance is much, much better. And typically, LED lights will last for at least 50,000 hours, meaning you'll change the light fixture before you change the lamp itself. Lighting controls are very inexpensive. Occupancy sensors and daylight sensing, where if you've got light streaming into a room, you do not have to keep those electric lights on, and it's become very inexpensive. Boilers. Boiler efficiency has improved to the extent where they are at 96% efficient. You can operate a boiler at 96% efficiency. Most old boilers, you'll be lucky if you're getting 60% efficiency. So we can almost get a 40% increase in efficiency with just by changing boilers. Also, in the old days, boilers were used, the same boiler was used for heating as for domestic hot water. So throughout the summer, in the middle of the hottest period, you'd be running this huge boiler inefficiently because Mrs. Smith on the 4th floor needed to do her dishes, and you're running this massive boiler. Very inefficient. Chillers have improved dramatically. Pumps and pump drives. Pumps do not have to run at 100% all the time. They can have what we call variable frequency drives. They can slow down, speed up, adds dramatically to the efficiency. Cooling towers. Very often they sit on the roof, don't get much attention until they fail. Cooling towers have improved a lot. Obviously, this has high capital cost, but can have quite a fast return on investment depending on the building. Finally, air sealing, weatherization. Doesn't cost much to to seal up leaks and some caulking and weather stripping, etc. Ventilation. Probably in high-rise buildings, ventilation becomes a huge issue. It's absolutely required to keep your building healthy, but bringing in outside air requires a lot of energy. You have to cool it and dehumidify it. So ventilation, there's lots and lots of options for improving the efficiency. Insulation on the building, even insulation on pipes and boilers. You go into a boiler room in the middle of summer and it's extremely hot. That's just wasted heat. Changing the subject slightly to sub-metering, again in high-rise condos or apartment buildings, being able to individually meter each apartment, each unit, will result in significant changes, mainly because people behave differently when they are paying individually for the energy that they use as opposed to a square foot basis. The Department of Energy denotes a 21% drop in general when you go to this self-metering, to individual meters, and it does not necessarily require the whole building to be rewired. It can be done fairly efficiently these days because of wireless systems, and can have a fast payback as well. So what does the future hold? Incentives will continue to grow. The money's still being collected, and we do not believe that New Jersey programs are going away anytime soon. We've heard for years that every year there's a rumor, this is the last year, this administration, that administration, we see no stopping of these incentive programs. Continual cost reductions. Equipment is becoming more and more efficient. There's new technology breakthroughs. Yesterday's pumps are today, there's something new and better, always something better. The SREC market, that was solar renewable energy credits. We do believe that in time, solar energy will come back. It's partly controlled by a job creation program, and that will come back too. SRECs, we need to keep an eye on them. They will come back. They're about $200 now. They were $600. They will come back. Finally, PJM. And PJM are the Pennsylvania, Jersey, and Maryland organization that controls distribution of energy, those power lines across the nation. They have incentives as well. And just by going for pay for performance or direct install, they will pay you money for doing nothing else. You'll just get an additional check from them. In summary, don't get distracted from first costs. Look at life cycle. Most common, lighting, boilers, and HVAC. Behavioral changes. People need to be educated how to save money. New Jersey incentive programs, clean energy, money available, and incentives make efficiency a no-brainer.
Thank you so much, Allan. Wow, that was a lot of information from both Mitch and Allan. And now we'll move on to your questions. I have the first question here for Mitch. How do you determine cost of energy? For example, a fence replacement.
This is Mitch. I'm not really sure of the question, because when we're dealing with a fence replacement, we're really dealing with the reduction in maintenance costs rather than a reduction in energy cost. So if you're talking about calculating the reduction in maintenance cost, what we do is we calculate what type of maintenance has to be done to that fence. And for example, if you go from a wood fence where you're staining it to a vinyl fence where you're not doing anything to it, that's how we would calculate the cost. But I'm really not sure what is meant by the cost of energy in a fence replacement project. So I'm assuming that that cost of energy is the cost of maintenance.
All right, very good. Thanks, Mitch. Now the next question goes out to Allan. Are condo multiplex buildings eligible for PSP programs? We are planning to reside the buildings and in the process improve on sheathing and installation.
Okay, so I think if you're just re-siding the building, that's not going to be enough alone for pay for performance, but if there are other measures that you are prepared to take in your building, in other words, if the HVAC systems need to be replaced in the near future, if the boilers need to be replaced, if the lighting is old, this may be a very good opportunity because you're doing the siding, and frankly, the siding is probably the most expensive part of all of that. So yeah, you may be eligible for pay for performance. Certainly, condo multiplexes are definitely eligible and have received lots of money from pay for performance.
All right, very good. Now the next question goes out to Mitch. About how much more does it cost to do a green reserve study as compared to a standard study?
Well, that question really relates to the type of community. For example, if you have a townhouse community with a small clubhouse and just fencing, and that's the type of things you're looking at, it's very inexpensive to do a green reserve study. And in some cases, we actually recommend that a green reserve study is not worth the expense to do it because there's really no place for savings. If you're talking about a high-rise building that has a significant amount of mechanical equipment, typically the cost increase is about 50% more to do, or 50 to 100% more to do that. For example, we just were retained to do a reserve study for high-rise. The cost of the reserve study was $7,000, and then the additional cost to make it a green reserve study was about another $6,000. So when you're dealing with high-rises, that's about the cost increase that you're looking at.
All right. Now I have another question for Allan. What about insulation in attics for condominium buildings? Are they eligible for incentives?
You know, there is an incentive really for almost every energy savings upgrade. And I always say, even if it's a few $100s, that's a few $100s you didn't have before you started. Interestingly enough, most of the heat lost from a single-story building or from the top story of a building is through the roof, is through the attic. So increasing the insulation or improving the insulation in an attic can be a huge, huge help. And yes, so there are incentives for doing that, and I would highly recommend re-insulating the attic. Very often we go into old buildings, older buildings, and the insulation has been wet at some time. And by the way, when insulation gets wet, it becomes really almost useless because the air gaps within the insulation disappear, and it gets squashed down. The insulation gets squashed down, so it loses its insulation value. So yes, there are incentives, and good idea to do that.
Mitch, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I'd like to add, when you're talking about attics in these type of buildings, there's usually one weak spot in those attics that may even offset your savings by adding additional insulation, and that's typically the door that you go up into the attic through. If you picture a home where you have warm air and you're heating in the winter, the warm air rises. And if you don't have insulation on the inside of the attic access hatch, that's really an opening that the warm air just flows up and goes directly into the attic and to the outside, and you're essentially throwing away that money because it's not insulated. So the first thing I would recommend you do is you go up into your attic and look to see if there's insulation on the attic access hatch, because again, that's just a hole in your ceiling where the energy goes out.
All right. We have another question where it's related to a building that is 75 years old, and it's a 75-year-old brick building, and they're doing a major facade restoration. Unfortunately, the windows are not being replaced, even though many are original frames and very deteriorated. Is there a typical percentage of the cost of such a window replacement that incentives will cover?
You know, windows are a very difficult item. typically windows are not that much energy is lost through windows. I know that is not the popular belief, but it is true that windows really do not account for a huge amount of energy loss. However, if you're sitting next to a leaking window and it's blowing onto you, that is a significant problem. And really in your building, and I see this is a 75-year-old building where you're changing the facade, it makes sense to me that you would do the windows as well, because it would be a good time to do it while you've got all that scaffolding up and you've got access to the windows. The problem is that because of the energy savings directly related to the windows, they are so small that the payback for windows is much greater than 10 years. Remember we said for pay for performance, the payback has to be within 10 years. For windows, believe it or not, it's closer to 20 years. So windows are not a good item for these pay for performance or these energy incentives. But even though they're not, it makes sense to me that you should be really looking to do the windows. You also do not indicate in the question how high the building is. Now, obviously, if it's a 10-story building, the cost of installing windows is a lot more expensive than if it's a 2-level building. So that would be another interesting question. But I would urge this building to take a careful look at replacing the windows as well.
Okay, I believe as part of that question, the building is actually 6 to 7 stories high, and it states here that the heating costs are not common. They are paid by the owners. Cannot quantify for the state. Does that make any difference?
No, absolutely not. It doesn't matter if it's paid for, in apartment buildings, it would typically be paid for by the landlord, by the owner of the building. In condos, it may be grouped together as a single utility bill that's divided out, or it may be individual meters. It does not make a difference to the state. That is not relevant. The incentives are still there. Also, this building with the windows, we've just got notification that it's a 6 to 7 story building, and unfortunately 6 or 7 stories quite difficult to access windows on the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th floor. So it really is not a good candidate. Unfortunately, windows are just not good candidates for these incentive programs.
All right, thanks, Alan. We have another question for Mitch here. Is the green reserve study beneficial for all community types?
Again, I had mentioned before that if you have a townhouse type community, it may not be beneficial because it really is based on what type of components and what type of mechanical equipment you have in regards to reducing the maintenance costs and the energy costs. But there's no question that in a high-rise building or a mid-rise building that it is absolutely cost-effective to do a green reserve study.
All right, I think we have a couple of more questions for Alan here. Are these energy savings incentives for multifamily buildings only?
Actually not. These programs are for anybody or any building types that are using energy in the state of New Jersey. Interestingly enough, we are working on a project now where it is a greenhouse, very large greenhouse. They've got 5 acres of greenhouse where they have to heat it in winter, and there's lots of lighting going on to make the plants grow, and that became a very good project for pay for performance. Industrial facilities, as I mentioned before, apartment buildings, high-rise, multifamily, all of those. If you're using energy, you're a good candidate for these incentive programs. I'll say one other thing, that your local supermarket is probably using these pay-for-performance incentive programs when they do a remodel there. They use a lot of energy.
All right, thank you very much. I believe we have exhausted all the questions, so I think we're going to be ending our webinar at this point. Thank you so much for listening in. We will be sending you out a survey. Please complete the survey and send it back to us. We definitely want to improve, and we'd like to hear back from you. As I said earlier, all the attendees will receive a email with the presentation, the PowerPoint presentation in PDF format. And this webinar will be uploaded onto our website by Friday the latest. And you can always log back in and listen to it again if there was something that you felt you missed. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.